Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
I really wish we had caught that statement on the air. Will's got a bearded hen on his desk.
Busted.
Well, he can do that again when we talk about how you shouldn't shoot bearded hens.
Yeah, there you go.
It's a bearded and a spurred hen.
Wow. You know, that's exceedingly rare.
with a white skull cap. Oh, wait.
We might be able to, I bet we could uniquely identify him based on his skull cap.
There's black tip feathers too, so I don't know, man. This hen is all
messed up.
Out of sorts.
Hey, they can define any way they want to.
Well,
this is going to be a good one.
Yeah, I have been anticipating this episode for quite some time, and I think a lot of our audience is as well. And I'm glad to have both of you here to share your excellent research with us that you've just completed.
Glad to sit down with you all again, as always.
Yeah, so we've got Dr. Craig Harper and Dr. Dave Buehler, both from the University of Tennessee, here to talk about some work that they recently completed that was sponsored by the Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency. And one of the reasons in particular, I guess the reason in particular that I'm excited to talk about it is theirs is the first study to directly assess the role or an aspect of the role of male harvest in turkey reproduction. But before we get into that, we wanted to provide you guys a chance to give a little bit of background information on the research and how it all started and how the project may have even morphed a little bit as it continued along.
Well, I guess it started in 2016 when TWRA contacted us and asked us if we would be interested in trying to find out why the turkey population, especially in some South Middle counties in Tennessee, where the turkey harvest was apparently declining. And it was widely recognized that the large winter flocks that we saw there, for example, in the late 1990s, where you literally could see a winter flock of 1,000 birds, and it's just staggering that had gone down in a big way, and nobody was seeing birds like that anymore. And it was widespread amongst landowners that they did not have, and they were not seeing the number of turkeys that they used to. And also that was reflected in the harvest, because the harvest in those counties, 5 counties, especially 3 or 4 of them along the Alabama border, had gone down about 30 to 35% over the course of several years. And there was concern there, not only about the harvest declining, the turkey population declining, but also, of course, why. And there was a lot of speculation about chicken manure being spread on fields and that causing disease problems. So there were lots and lots of questions. And so Dave and I set out to implement a project where we would primarily look at and focus on reproduction and productivity of wild turkeys in those areas. And we set it up where we had study sites, or capture areas, I guess you could call it, in 3 counties along the Alabama border where the decline had been occurring, and then in 2 counties adjacent to those 3 to the north, where the harvest had either been stable or perhaps slightly increasing. And so we thought that would be good to look at productivity in those counties where the population and harvest was declining and compare that to the productivity in those counties where production apparently was remaining stable. And so we trapped a lot of birds. We tried to keep at least 100 birds on air each year, and we did, 100 hens. And we trapped gobblers as well, but not as many gobblers as we did hens, because the focus was on the productivity. It was our idea that there was problems likely associated with nest success and poult survival, that type of thing especially. And so we captured birds, and we put both VHF and GPS transmitters on birds, and we followed them for 4 years, looking at, all the vital rates that you could look at, as well as habitat use. And on top of that, we collected data from hunters. We surveyed the hunters in the 5-county area for all of those years. We had a very complete survey that we would implement each year and get their immediate response from the previous turkey season back. So we had a very complete data set. And on top of that, another professor, Rick Gerhold at the University of Tennessee, he set out to look at disease issues and implications from that. And so I think they collected either parts of birds, organs, blood samples from live birds, etc., either parts of dead birds or blood samples from live birds for, Dave, I think it was like 800 birds over the course of time through the study. And so they have a very complete picture of what was going on disease-wise. And so we were collecting both harvest information, hunter success information, the biological information from the birds, disease information, as complete of a data set as we could think of for 4 years. And then after we had finished data collection of 4 years, that's when, the talk of perhaps we're opening the season too early. And this discussion was going on, of course, in many states, and it was going on in Tennessee as well. And it was at that time in 2020 that the commissioners with the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency voted to implement an experimental 2-week delay in certain counties. And 3 of those counties were the counties on the Alabama border where we had been working. And the 2 counties adjacent to the north did not receive a delay. And so we had 4 years of complete data on turkey biology, hunter satisfaction, harvest, and disease prior to a 2-week delay being implemented. And so we collected all of those data from 2017 to 2020 for 4 years. And then in 2021, that was the year of the first year of the experimental delay.
And just to clarify, Craig, the experimental delay was done, just for our audience, was done prior to the statewide delay that was implemented more recently, correct?
Yes. In 2021, the 2-week delay, the experimental delay, was implemented in those 3 counties. And so since 1986, the turkey season in Tennessee had always opened on the Saturday closest to April 1st, and with an annual bag limit of 4 birds, four males. And so over all of that time, 30 plus years, the population had increased, the harvest had increased, and then it had leveled off and it had declined in some counties, and primarily in those counties that we were studying the birds. And so the delay then opened the season 2 weeks later. And so we had a 2-week experimental delay in 2021 and also in 2022. In 2021, with the 2-week experimental delay, the bag limit was reduced from 4 to 3. Then in 2023, the 2-week delay was implemented statewide. And so we have 4 years of baseline data in all 5 counties, and then 2 years of data looking at the effect of the 2-week delay in those 3 southern counties versus the 2 adjacent northern counties that did not get a delay for 2 years. And then in 2023, all counties statewide were delayed, and the bag limit was reduced from 3 to 2.
And Craig, if I can jump in, one thing to keep in mind is that this is just one study region in one state where we've actually collected data to look at some of these questions. But, we're in 5 counties on, I think, 382 separate individual private land ownerships and 3 or 4 WMAs. We're on over 100,000 acres in a study area that's over 1 million acres in total. So, it is one study site, in the Middle Tennessee that is representative of that region, but it's one of the largest projects, I think, that's been conducted in terms of the overall scope, in terms of the length of the project, and in terms of the number of birds we've radio tagged. Because, we've monitored, I think it's 632 hen years now, a hen with a radio on it for a year, and almost 500 nests. So we have a large database going over 7 years' time over a 5-county region. And so in terms of scope, this is pretty impressive,
pretty unique
in terms of what we're able to pull off.
Well, Dave, I wanted to clarify one thing, but also add to what you just said. So you have 2 years of delay in those 3 counties where they were compared to counties that were not delayed, but you actually have 3 years post delay in those experimental counties because of the statewide delay as well. So you actually have 4 years before and 3 years after that delayed season.
Yeah, and if you could design this project perfectly, you would set it up as we did initially and then swap it after a couple of years. Well, we didn't exactly swap it in 2023. All 5 counties went delay, but it's really interesting because, if it was going to work, adding those 2 northern counties in and testing them would be a reasonable thing to do. We just want to swap those 3 southern counties, back to no delay with an ideal and experimental design. So,
well, I think it is noteworthy to say, if we were going to design an experiment, Will and I have talked about this with several things. We would just design it in a before or after control impact design with large scales and large sample size and long term. And you guys did that. I mean, that is pretty impressive. And I would say it's potentially, if not the best experimental manipulation in the turkey literature base.
Yeah, I'm not aware of an experiment on turkeys at this kind of scale that has been, as well designed. And I think that, we call this a Baki design all the time in ecology, before after control impact. It's just an acronym. And the value of having that design is that it provides you with control over time, because you have before and after, but you also have that control, this never treated in any way, to compare to the treatment. So you have comparison of treatment versus control, and then over time. So if there are, we talk about this all the time on the show, we have high annual variability, right, in turkey reproduction, regardless of if we change anything or not. So having a number of years before and a number of years after can, help you account for that variability. But then you compare between treatment and control to see if a change from one year to the next is a result of that treatment, or we're seeing it maybe both in treatment and control counties, so that we know that that's just part of that natural variation that we're not necessarily interested in measuring in this project. We only want to measure those things directly related to that treatment that we implemented, which in this case is that 2-week delay.
Yeah, essentially what the design is allowing you to do is get a cause and effect. You're getting at a causative factor, and you're tracking various things that could show you what mechanism is linked to that cause, which is very different than tagging a whole bunch of individuals somewhere and then trying to correlate it to things that are going on, which is what we typically do, especially with species like turkeys that are really hard to do experiments at this kind of scale. So whether it was planned or not, I'm really glad it happened.
Well, and we've got to really give credit to TWA and the commissioners for getting us set up in the first place to be able to conduct this scope of research for 4 years, and then for having the wherewithal to say, we can do an experiment. If you're all interested, we could experimentally test this. And the commission stepped up and put it into action on the ground and sold it to the hunters and everybody else. And so, and the other thing about all that is we have wildlife officers and biologists and managers helping us trap and with landowners and everything else for years and years and years. And we come back after 4 years and say, hey guys, this is what we'd like to do. And they're saying like, what?
We want to take 2 weeks of your season away now.
Yeah. So at any rate, the field level support for the project from the agency and the support from the commission, was really outstanding for making this happen. And
and I might speak up and say something about the turkey hunters and the respondents in those counties. Marcus, you say, you want to do what? Take away 2 weeks of my season. I mean, that's your initial impulse, but to their credit, I mean, turkey hunters are willing to do whatever they need to do to conserve the bird to the best of our abilities. And they were willing to, okay, we can go without some of the season, open the season later, a reduced bag limit, et cetera, whatever we need to do, because we love the bird, we love hunting the bird, and we want this to continue. So it was really good to see the acceptance and the agreement among hunters to try whatever needed to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really good. Well, I had a question, just taking a step back for a moment. It hasn't been real clear I guess across the range of the Easterns whether or not the abundance is declining, but you guys have some data that you looked at from Tennessee's perspective. Can you describe what, just at a state level, the population trends have looked like over the past couple of decades?
Well, the interesting thing is that the landowners and hunters on the ground, they can tell if you've got 100 birds or you have 10. And so, they've been talking about this for the last decade, really. But the state agency collects bolt per hen data and harvest data. And those are two things that are, related to population level, but they're not perfect indices to what the population is doing. But fortunately, we've got breeding bird survey data in Tennessee and virtually all the other states and in North America that goes back to 1966. And with breeding bird surveys, they lay out a 25-mile route on rural roads. They drive that route in the first week in June and stop every half mile and listen for 3 minutes and look for, all species breeding birds, including turkeys. And so it's a consistent method that has been carried out for 50 years. And when we went and looked at those data recently, it was extremely clear that the population in Tennessee peaked in about 2013 and has declined over the last 10 years by about 60%. And so there's no doubt in my mind that, yes, indeed, the turkey population has declined statewide. And the breeding bird survey data is a very good way to look at it. Mm-hmm. A consistently run, repeatable monitoring effort.
Yeah. Well, that's really useful. So it gives you an independent, clear data set. I've heard Will say this a couple of times about the harvest rate. It's like, if the harvest is increasing, well, we're killing too many. But if the harvest is decreasing, we got to restrict harvest because we're declining. And it's kind of, that sometimes seems circular.
Yeah.
Well, the interesting
but you've got an independent survey that's really robust.
Right. When you look at the Tennessee harvest data, we have been consistently at or above 30,000 for the last 10 years. And so if you're just looking at harvest, Tennessee doesn't even have a problem. But when you start to understand what the population is doing and you understand the dynamics of harvest, then you can start to understand that, well, harvest is lagging what the population is actually doing. And of course, the harvest is based on effort and the number of hunters and the weather and the regulations, a whole host of things. So not just based on how many birds are out there.
Yeah. It's pretty common to talk to landowners who are turkey hunters, and I'll just throw out a scenario. Yeah, we used to have 10 or 12 gobblers on our property every year, and now we only have 4 or 3 or what have you. But they're killing the same number, and so the harvest is not, as Dave mentioned, directly consistent with the population. Yeah, there's a relationship there, but it certainly is possible to see and have fewer birds on your property, but still kill as many. And that's that lag time that he's talking about. If that decline continues, well, ultimately the harvest will decline also.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
I think another important point to make about the breeding bird survey data, and Dave, you kind of alluded to this, is that the value in that data compared to just looking at harvest numbers over time is, particularly over the last several years, as many states have changed seasons and bag limits in response to real or perceived declining populations. That's going to influence the harvest, right? Like if we cut down the bag or we reduce the season, you would think that that's going to influence the harvest, or maybe just hunter effort. But either way, it messes with the index, whereas the breeding bird survey, that's not the case.
Yes, independent.
And it's counting all birds and counting.
Sure. So before we start really, diving into the actual study, one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we get to is kind of y'all's hypotheses at the outset that were relative to the role that season date may or may not play in or not season date, but timing of male harvest might play in reproduction.
Well, of course, this has been talked about a lot, as it's been a discussion across many states. But the hypothesis is if the hunting season is starting early enough such that dominant gobblers are being killed before they can do the preponderance of breeding, then you're going to see a negative effect on reproduction. Perhaps fewer hens would be bred. When you kill dominant gobblers early, there could be a disruption in the hierarchy, and the hens that would be associated with a particular gobbler or two then might be delayed in their nesting. And so the timing of nesting could be shifted later, and it also could be lengthened. If most hens were being bred in a group early on, then arguably your nesting season would be earlier and closer together. And so possibly you would see increased hatchability because there would be increased fertilization of the eggs. And so there's lots of things that can be looked at. There's lots of vital rates that are associated with reproduction. And so that's what we did. We wanted to look at every one of those and see how delaying the hunting season by 14 days would affect each one of those.
Mm-hmm. So what were those?
I guess we ended up, we looked at 7 or 8 different vital rates. And some of them, we didn't even expect there would be an effect. And those are sort of controls, like clutch size, is largely determined both genetically from the bird and in terms of the nutritional condition of the hen. And so we didn't expect clutch size to change. But we had clutch size as a parameter that we measured. And so we could test it and say, well, is anything going on with clutch size? Well, our hypothesis was no difference. And the results supported that. So the good thing is we've got this big suite of vital rates that we looked at, some of which are like real key to the hypothesis, and some are a little bit of a stretch, and some have no relationship. And so it allows us to look at different sorts of parameters and and see which ones are the most important and what's the evidence to suggest that something's going on there, as opposed to some of these other things that are a little more far-fetched.
Yeah, and so, of course, they included, first off, the nesting rate. What percentage of hens is breeding and nesting? The timing of nesting. When does nest initiation peak? When does nest incubation peak? Then, of course, the clutch size, hatchability of the eggs, the percentage of eggs that in the clutch that hatch, nest success, poult survival, hen survival, and then, of course, we also calculated fecundity and recruitment into next year's breeding population. So those were the 8.
Mm-hmm. So you thought that maybe, so it seems like the timing of nesting and the hatchability and then the nest participation were kind of like the 3 key metrics that you would have most expected to be impacted if this hypothesis were true. But then there's also been some speculation about maybe nest success or brood survival rates increasing in response to this because nesting, earlier and then that nest translating into poults hatching out earlier might better match vegetation phenology or development throughout the growing season so that they had the maximized opportunity to conceal the nest and then for the poults to grow at the most rapid rate or have better concealment cover if they were born during a certain time of the year. Is that right?
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
And then the other thing is that, like, those parameters that you were talking about those are kind of mechanistic things in terms of how this might work. But then the ultimate question is, well, are we putting any more birds into the fall population or
Absolutely.
into the breeding population next year? And so that's where recruitment comes in, which, we have calculated then to say, well, ultimately, does it make a difference at the end of the day? And so we've got it at both ends in terms of mechanistically up front, what's going on, and then ultimately at the end of the day, the end of the year, have we brought more hens into the breeding population in the following year to grow the population?
Yeah, that all makes sense. That's a very well-rounded study because oftentimes, as biologists, we're really interested in the mechanisms, right? Like what is causing this? What is the cause and effect? Because armed with that knowledge, you can better address any particular situations that arise that pose challenges to your objectives. But then, especially like as a turkey hunter, from a turkey hunter's perspective, we want more gobblers, right, in the woods to hunt each spring. So you've got both of those covered.
Yeah, and I really love that you have an experimental design where you can establish causation on the mechanism. That's so rare that we can say that, but you can show, okay, we implemented a delay and hatchability changed this much in response to that delay because you have that control right beside it to know what the effect was.
And I'm really glad that we had 3 years of the delay because I think certainly we should be able to see any effect of the delay if there is one after 3 years, because when you think about it, the majority of the birds that are killed are 2 and 3 years old. Yes, there are some older birds. We just got one transmitted bird submitted this past week that was at least 7 years old. Based on when we captured him initially, but the majority of the male birds that are killed are 2 and 3 years old, and so certainly you should be able to see any effect of the delay after having implemented it for 3 years.
Yeah, and that's apparently common across a lot of areas because we just had an episode a few weeks ago where we talked to Patrick Whiteman from Georgia, and he was saying that 2-year-old birds have the highest hunting mortality rate. So those are
80% of that cohort is killed, right, on average. I think that's what he said.
I think that's
it was
right.
far less percent. It was 30% overall on average across the whole study, across all age classes, but 80% bottleneck right there on the 2-year-old, which they do fill most of my bag. The handful of turkeys I kill from time to time, there's often 2-year-olds.
I prefer the dumb ones, regardless of age.
Yeah. Well, the dumb ones usually don't make it to the older age. So.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, I think that's a really important point. The other thing that I think is important here is that you have some predictions, I guess, of how you think different vital rates might change in response based on the biology of the animal and how the hypothesis has been articulated. And I have seen this discussed in various ways in various places, but several of the vital rates, I don't know that we would need 3 years. I mean, for example, if you removed males from a population and that caused the hens to reassess which male, and that caused her to delay, well, immediately after a change in the timing such that you don't remove those males, there's no longer a disruption in that female choice. So you would expect the nest initiation timing to be earlier, immediately.
Well, and I think that's a good point. And the other thing about the timing is that in some other studies, most recently by McKeever et al., they showed a relationship between the timing of nesting and nest success. But in our study, we looked exclusively at the initial nesting attempt. And the reason why we did that is because, our birds are nesting from April 1st until August 1st. Well, a bird nesting in June, July, and up until August, they have no idea what happened on April 1st, whether there were hunters or not. So we looked exclusively at initial nests. And we also looked at the timing of those initial nests compared to nest success over the course of the whole study.
Sure.
And we didn't see any support for this notion that earlier nests, initial nests in our study, were more successful. So that basic premise of moving up the nesting cycle earlier and having the hens be more successful just wasn't borne out when you only look at initial nests.
Yeah,
Yeah,
of course,
so in other words,
it's well acknowledged that re-nest are generally less successful than initial nest. And so when we looked only at nest success of initial nests, those later initial nests trended to be more successful than the earlier initial nest.
Oh, wow.
And re-nest occurred anywhere from, I think it was 5 or 6 days after the initial nest being depredated to 56 days after that initial nest being depredated. So there's a wide range of time in which a hen may take before she re-nests. And so for multiple reasons, we only looked at nest success of the initial nests with regard to if the delay is having an impact or not.
Right.
And it didn't. And with regard to the timing, there was a 2 or 3 day shift in timing of peak nest initiation or peak or median nest incubation initiation in both the delayed counties and no delay counties. So the relationship was the same. And both of them shifted 2 or 3 days earlier after the delay. And so, I know this can be confusing, but what that means is in the no delay counties, the counties that did not have the experimental delay, the timing shifted early on about 2 days when the delay was implemented, but there was no delay implemented in the no delay counties. And so that happened.
So in other words, because you had a control,
correct,
you could see that was not a treatment effect. It was variation in the population.
I think another important point to make here too, Craig, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but is that you had the data from the control in the same year because there may have been environmental factors like weather that was affecting that shift in timing across both your treatment and control. And if you hadn't had that control, you may have made the inference if you're just looking before and after a delay without the control, you may have made the inference that that was associated with the delay.
Yes. And there also was no difference in the length of the nesting season, whether that be for the initial nest or for all nest, including all renest. In both the no delay counties and the delay counties, the nest season length was almost exactly the same. Again, I think it was like 2 or 3 days, and the raw numbers for the nesting season in the delayed counties actually lengthened by about 3 days. And I'm not saying the delay had anything to do with that. It's just that once the delay was implemented, the nesting season did not contract or, come together in a shorter amount of time. I wouldn't say that it protracted or got longer, but it remained.
So you're not saying the treatment caused it to become longer, but the fact that it did is pretty strong evidence that it didn't contract.
Right. And again, like Will mentioned earlier, and you just cannot stress this enough, there is so much annual variability in all of those vital rates, whether it be the percentage of the hens that nest, the hatchability. There's even some variability there. Variability, of course, in nest success, and variability in poult survival. And so let's just say if there was some small effect of the delay, which we didn't realize, it would have to be greater than the annual variation if you expect to realize that effect. And there's a lot of annual variation. So anything you can do to affect those vital rates, it's going to have to be pretty big.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've talked about a few of the vital rates. Are there anything, or did you measure anything that responded to the season delay?
With regard to being statistically significant or statistically different, no. Now, there were some trends one way or another with both county groups within a couple of the vital rates, nest success being one of them. And so percentage point wise, there was a little greater nest success in the delayed counties than no delay counties. But again, when the annual variation is calculated into that, it was washed out, and it did not come out as being statistically significant.
Mm-hmm.
So you didn't detect any vital rate response across the 8 variables?
No, and I'm sure Dave will share this, but especially when fecundity and recruitment were calculated, we saw increases in both delayed and no delayed counties, and they mirrored each other. There was no trend. There was no nothing. They were exactly the same with regard to increase in the recruitment rates.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why that experimental design is so critical, is because the first 4 years were, I guess, average years in terms of productivity of these turkey population, but 21 and 22 were really good years.
Yeah.
And so we got this bump in terms of everything, in terms of nest success and clutch size. Everything we measured bumped in 21 and 22. And we would have, if we hadn't had those controls, we would have said, hey, it is working. Look at this.
Look at this.
But it bumped in the controls as much as it did in those delayed counties.
Yeah.
And so that was the key thing. And then in 2023 comes along, and we're we're feeling pretty good because at least everything's going up. 2023 was the worst year ever out of the 7 years. And our overall nest success.
3 years into the delay was the
3
worst.
years into the delay, all 5 counties delayed. Our nest success in 2023 across all 5 counties was 17.6%.
That's not very good.
No, it was terrible. And so, that's why that experimental design and having multiple years is so critical, because it would have been very easy to jump on the bandwagon and say, hey, it's working, and then just say, okay, let's go.
Yeah.
That's the end of the story.
I find it remarkable. I wonder if this is bouncing around in Will's head, but we just had a discussion with Adam Buehler from Mississippi in our previous episode, and he called out the same years as being up in Mississippi. Of course, they haven't changed anything, and they have one of the earliest seasons and kill a lot of turkeys, but
Yeah.
their productivity based on the poult per hen and harvest data mirrored what you're talking about, Dave. In terms of timing,
they
the
also
years.
did in the North Carolina study, as I remember. I talked to Chris Mormon regularly, and we were discussing what was happening over here in Tennessee and what was happening in North Carolina. He said, we're seeing the exact same thing. Back in whenever it was, 19, 19, 20, 21, whenever it was.
Yeah.
I think they collected data for 3 years over there, and they saw the exact same trends in terms of increases in some years and decreases in some years, and it occurred over the same years.
Yeah, I think,
same trend.
Marcus, I think Chris even may have mentioned that when he came on the show before, that production in 21 and 22 tended to mirror what they were seeing in Tennessee. So to me, that's A, super interesting, and B, it kind of screams that it's some large-scale trend in weather patterns or something like that influencing nesting.
Yeah, it seems to be independent of the season, and then your data supports that, from the experimental manipulation. I mean, we've got Mississippi on one hand is really early. North Carolina is more consistent with that later start date, and then Tennessee was in the middle and had an experimental manipulation, and yet all three still mirrored each other in productivity through that time period.
Yeah, so I guess the North Carolina data were collected in 2021 and 22. Isn't that correct, Will?
I can't remember exactly. I know that I feel pretty confident that 21 was the year that at least y'all matched up. It may have been 22 as well.
Okay.
Yeah, and so the interesting thing to me is, you set aside the dominant gobbler theory. If you look at our vital rates for this population, and you look at all these other southeastern studies, the basic vital rates just do not look good. And we've got Lindsay Phillips, our PhD student, doing integrated population modeling right now to kind of put it all together. But when I look at hen survival, our hen survival in 6 out of 7 years was less than 50%, and as low as like 38%. And then our nest success, we only had 1 year when it was greater than 30%, and it went all the way down to 17.6. And then the poult survival was terrible. Poult survival ranged.
Those other ones were terrible too.
Yeah. So poult survival went from like 5%, 30-day poult survival, to a high of 35% in 2021. So when you put all three of those key parameters on top of each other, we only had 1 year where all three parameters seemed to hit. And it actually wasn't 2021, because 2021 had poor hen survival. But 2018 was actually a good year. But when you think about, what is going on with the turkey population, it is just pretty straightforward. The hens, the nests, and the poults are not surviving at high enough rate collectively. And why is that? Because things are eating them, as Craig is very good at saying. It's predation, and predation has reached, in our sense, a tipping point where the chance of successfully putting all these parameters together and having a boom year, which drives upland game bird population dynamics, is very low. They just are not hitting all together to grow the population back. And so when you've got 6 out of 7 years where you're losing birds, you would need a heck of a boom to make up for that. And we're just not seeing it. And it's predation. And Craig, you probably want to jump in and add your sense to that as well.
Well, just to say that there can be a number of things that are going on simultaneously, but Dave is correct. The animals are dying and primarily from predation. But we haven't analyzed things such as landscape scale change yet. But I don't think we have to analyze landscape scale change to know that turkeys don't have as much place to live as they did 30 years ago, with the increase in human population, the decreasing private land ownership sizes. I mean, it's decreasing exponentially. the change in what people are doing on their property, the infrastructure that is associated with the increased human population, with larger roads, huge buildings, shopping center complexes, building medical complexes, etc. And this is happening all over. I believe, although we have not measured some of the changes in turkey habitat on properties, region wide, but I certainly believe that habitat management can play a role in that we could manage habitat for turkeys certainly better than what is being done, and that could be used to move the needle. But with all things as they are right now, the predation rates on the birds are preventing them from increasing in population, at least in our area.
So given all that, and Craig, I know y'all collected vegetation data at all the nests too, and we've talked about that a lot on this show, and I think you've even come on and shared some of that information about the lack of quality nesting and brood rearing cover and things like that. But simplifying this all a little bit more, and I'm happy for you to share that information if you want to go back into it again. But at least what I'd like to get to is, so if you were a landowner in one of these counties and you could apply the numbers in y'all's study to that individual property, what would be kind of your order of operations or the things that you would go to try to remedy that issue with fecundity?
Probably more than anything to have good brood rearing cover. And brood rearing cover has been identified in the literature as primarily herbaceous, although it could be some woody cover, but at a height that the hen can see and at a height that conceals the poults. The visibility is very important for the hen, and an open structure near ground level is critical for the poults to be able to move through and glean insects and follow around behind the hen and get from place to place and not expend all of their energy trying to get through an entanglement of dense grass and other vegetation. And we're not done with the brood survival. With the brood habitat use analysis, but very preliminary results indicate that of our brood locations within a few weeks' time after hatch, only 15% of those were in fields. And it's pretty widely renowned that fields are some of the best brood rearing cover that hens seek out. And so when I visited these areas, both private land sites and public land sites, you could quickly see why the poults were not in these fields, because they were not managed such that the structure for broods was optimized. They were cluttered with thatch and vegetation down low, and the overall height of the vegetation in the fields was far in excess for what would be considered optimal for hens. And then they were being relegated to use woods in which there was very little and sparse cover. And just as a biologist having knowledge of the requirements for turkeys, you could walk in those areas and not be surprised at all that poult survival was very low. And there's certainly, we won't get into it unless you want to, but there's certainly things that you can do to make your fields great brood cover, and there's also things that you can do to make your woods great brooding cover. And some of the hardwood, the oak woodland management that we've been doing, it's just outstanding. And as I have said many times, I think if I had to narrow down and determine one vegetation type that would be the single best for wild turkeys, it would be an open oak woodland that is managed with frequent fire. You have nesting cover, brooding cover, roosting cover, loafing, foraging areas. Something is there for turkeys at all times of the year and during all periods of their life. But who and how many people are going into their woods and reducing the canopy cover by 30 to 40% and burning in their woods every 1 to 3 years? That would be next to nobody.
Hopefully all of our listeners.
And the same is true with pines, and of course there's been extensive work with turkeys and pine systems where they've provided all of these answers with regard to how to manage pines and optimize habitat for turkeys. But the same thing needs to be done in hardwood areas. So there's a lot of work that can be done to improve fields and improve your forested acreage for turkeys. But then also, and this is a little more art than science, although there is a little science that's beginning to look at this, and that is the arrangement. What is the arrangement and the scale of management that needs to be done to optimize brooding cover, areas that are essentially the best structure for nesting, how far apart from different foraging areas? So how to set up a property specifically for wild turkeys. That's a big deal right there. It's not just having a little something here and a little something over there, but it's a plan where you're actually laying out a property to best arrange all of the different types of cover and food resources that they would need.
That's good stuff.
Well, and then, in my opinion, and as we have pointed out in our summary, Dave and I prepared a project summary. We make the statement that in order to see increased turkey numbers on most properties, it's going to require not only habitat management, but very likely some level of predator control, whether it be just nest predators or what, to help move the needle with regard to how many birds we're seeing recruited into the spring population. And there's some things that could be done with regard to harvest regulations that I think could help also. But I believe the habitat management and probably some level of predator control is going to be necessary on most properties.
Well, that was one thing I was going to say and ask you guys what your thoughts on were. But one thing I've said something, and I've heard you all say something along these lines at some point. Poults, if we just focus on poults for a minute, poults without cover get eaten. That's how they die. So improving cover resources is likely to improve success in poults because less of them get eaten, principally. Second, with the landscape changes, and particularly with some of the practices like feeding that are subsidizing predators, most likely at unnaturally high levels, we probably are in a unique context now where not only has the habitat quality improved for predators while declining simultaneously for turkeys,
Exactly.
We're also doing things like feeding to supplement the predator population at the same time, potentially concentrate turkeys with them as well. So, that's another thing to keep in mind here. And without substantial changes at the landscape scale and those factors, do you think that some level of trapping is going to have to be a part of the equation, given that we're doing all these things to be favorable for predators?
I think obviously something will have to change. I don't know if I should say this or not, but like my grandpa used to tell me,
it out.
You can wish in one hand and do something else in the other one and see which one fills up the fastest. You got to do something. You can't just hope and wish for change. You've got to implement something. So we're going to have to enhance cover for turkeys, food resources for turkeys, and also reduce on many properties the number of animals that eat them. And again, this is anecdotal, but I work with many landowners on an annual basis, and especially, and to your point, Marcus, on the larger properties. for those who, now they are also doing a good job of habitat management, but when they put some level of predator management, which typically is targeting nest predators prior to the nesting season. Some also trap coyotes, but most of them are focusing on nest predators in the couple of months prior to nesting season. They don't have a problem. They're doing just fine, and they're enjoying lots of birds and maintaining a relatively high harvest. And again, that's anecdotal, but it's pretty strong evidence to me.
Yeah. So in those instances, those relatively large landowners are implementing what you consider really high quality habitat management and coupling that with nest predator removal.
Yes, at least moderate quality habitat management. Some of them very high quality, what I would consider. But it's striking for those that are implementing some level of predator control that it's pretty doggone consistent that they're doing good.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what that is? That's another level of work. It's just like weeds in your fields, unwanted plants that you're trying to get rid of. It's not a one-time application. It's something that you're going to have to keep up with if you want it. But there again, I think most turkey hunters, or of course landowners who are interested in managing their property for turkeys, I think it's something that they will welcome. And for example, here in Tennessee, the commissioners have enabled that. They have enabled landowners to manage their properties against predators when that's an issue by passing what I would consider very sound rules and regulations. For example, allowing coons to be trapped year round and bobcats to be killed, for example, during big game seasons. I mean, I'm not saying it's going to change the world, but if I'm sitting there with a bow hunting, or if I'm sitting there as a turkey hunter, turkey hunting, and a bobcat walks by, and I would like to enjoy the experience of killing that bobcat and having the hide tanned, etc. Why not? You're not damaging the bobcat population. You're not going to kill that many. So I mean, it's just that they've enabled some things to happen that private landowners can do a little more than what they could just a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It making the toolbox available.
Right.
Well, and I think, when we looked at both our quail project and our turkey project, the one thing we still are working on is trying to determine how much brood habitat you need, in a landscape to basically sustain a population. And what we don't know is if you, get enough brood habitat out there, do you need predator management or not? Or how much additional benefit would you get from predator management? So those are studies that, we still are interested in looking at because, very few of the wildlife management areas are really optimal for quail or for turkeys, even the quail focal areas. But if the agencies focus on certain areas and say, okay, this is going to be one of our premier turkey management areas, and they put all that great habitat on the ground, they're probably going to see a pretty sizable benefit. But will it be enough to actually grow that population back without having some level of predator management? We don't know. It's still an outstanding question for research to determine, how much bang for your buck can you get with habitat management in and of itself, and how much, and then what else can you do if you actually address the predator issue?
Yeah. And this is something that we've talked about a lot over the past, year and several months. And we do have, some data from the quail literature where they've suggested, they've looked at farms that were trapped versus farms that had habitat improvement, and then farms that had habitat improvement plus trapping. And they generally find that the habitat improvements elicits a greater response. And then the greatest response was from habitat plus trapping. But I wish we were also sitting here having a discussion about a before impact or before after control impact study with predator control in turkeys, because one of the reasons that we're sometimes hesitant to make the recommendation that folks turn to that tool, or we never dissuade them from it as long as it doesn't take away from other things that we know will move the needle. But one thing that gives us pause is that we don't have hard data on, what is the actual percent increase that you're likely to achieve with trapping. We just don't have those data. But I think another important thing to keep in mind, and I can't remember which one of y'all said it, it was a few minutes ago, but I think the predator context has changed too, because, back in the early 2000s, when most states were experiencing their record harvest, if we're willing to accept that as, that was associated with peaks in populations as well, and think that that's an honest index. If you look at trapping participation data in most southeastern states, it was at a real low during that time period.
Rock bottom at that time, yeah.
Right, and so we're experiencing a little bit of a resurgence in trapping participation in the last several years, which I think is a great thing because it's almost a lost art. And we've got more trapping going on now than ever, but we didn't have much of any going on during the peaks in population. So, I'm willing to say, well, maybe some things have changed since then. The context is a bit different today.
Well, and I came to Tennessee in 1991, a few years back, and one of my good friends and mentors was Billy Mincer in our program. And when I first showed up in Tennessee, every time we drove across the state, he had a little notebook. If he saw a dead coon on the highway, he'd write it down, because through 1987, TWA was translocating coons to new counties where there was a perceived absence of raccoons. And so they were doing raccoon restoration through the late 80s. And then the other thing was coyote populations went from west to east across the state during that same period. So in 1990, the coyote populations were not anywhere near what they are today. So, sure. And then of course we've got armadillos. So, I mean, when you take some of those anecdotal, pieces from 1990, and then you look at today, how ridiculous it would be driving up and down the road and writing down each coon that you saw dead on the road. You'd be pretty busy.
You'd fill up your book every trip, wouldn't you?
So, I mean, that kind of change, I think, in spite of the fact that there's big changes in how much trapping is going on, that kind of change in those populations, I think, is probably pretty remarkable.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was just going to add, we covered a couple of studies recently showing a precipitous decline in the use of several turkey predators when you do things that y'all were talking about, like open up the forest and start burning frequently. And we have covered what I would call pretty ample evidence that feeding is concentrating predators and probably subsidizing them, several of the things relevant to turkeys. And the landscape is changing because of the lack of management with fire as one principal thing, but also the other changes that Craig was talking about that are also beneficial, to predators. Like, I think it'd be kind of silly to think that we're not sustaining a much higher level of predators and in a context that's much poorer for turkeys to evade predation at the same time.
Absolutely.
I totally agree. And something else that I think can be a problem for individual landowners, especially those who have, relatively small properties, not 500 or 1,500 acres, but, you got 80 or 150 acres or whatever the case may be, or smaller than that, and you're trying to turkey hunt, and there's not as many birds as there used to be. But what is everybody around you doing? They're throwing corn on the ground. You can hardly kill a bird around here that does not have corn in its crop. I certainly do not put corn out for turkeys, but any bird, and I can ask neighbors, friends, whoever around here, nearly every one of them will have corn in their crop. Although that's illegal, that's what's happening. And I said somewhere else, they were talking about outlawing decoys and reaping and that kind of thing, which, that would be fine with me, but I made the statement I would be willing to put a lot of money on the line that a whole lot more birds are being killed with corn than there are with any kind of decoy.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the added problem, and I'm talking about baiting turkeys in with corn, not necessarily a disease.
Well, it's a different aspect of this problem where
and
people
then
are
you're
killing
elevating the predator populations, and it's like, and with the smaller property ownerships, it's like a perfect storm against turkeys, and so they have a lot of pressure against them right now on a number of fronts.
Yeah, I mean, it's like when you look at it the way that you just described it, Craig, it's like why would we expect to have anything but a turkey population problem right now?
Exactly. You know, if you're in a landscape with large properties, that can be quite different,
Right.
although there still can be problems. But especially when you're in a landscape that has smaller property ownerships, you've set up things perfectly for the predators, and a lot of people then are going to have to do something together to do something positive for turkeys, and that's difficult to pull off.
Well, and you also have that added pressure that, I mean, how many landowners do you talk about, especially the smaller ones, that they say, I have to compete with my neighbors?
Yeah,
that's why they say they're putting it on the ground, but you know they're feeding because they have to compete with their neighbors, not because they want to. You know, some of them probably do, but I think we do have this issue where a lot of them are doing it because they're neighbors, and the neighbor they're talking about is doing it because they are.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's exactly right.
Well, I didn't think we were going to end up on feeding, but
Here we are.
So I do want to reiterate, I mean, I think you guys and TWRA and the commissioner should be commended for such
Yes.
an exceptional study. I mean, it's really impressive. I want to reiterate how special that is. It's potentially, if not the strongest experiment we've ever had on the species. So that's excellent. And unfortunately, from what I am hearing from you guys, does not seem to be the answer. You know, moving the season's not going to correct all these other problems that are influencing turkey productivity.
When we went into the experimental part of the project, you know, we thought it was really cool because we set it up, and we went in, you know, really pretty much naive, thinking that, you know, maybe there is something going on here.
It's certainly plausible.
Yeah, and let's see what happens. But then as the data started coming in, it's like, well, what the heck? You know, it doesn't look like it's shaping up. And then the more data we got after, you know, year one and year two, and especially in 2023, it's kind of like, well, you know, this whole mechanism, given the populations we have, the timing of the season, you know, we went from early nest initiation around April 1st to early incubation around April 15th. So, you know, we're looking at it right in that window. You start thinking, well, you know, these birds have been out there since February, strutting, courtship, breeding, and everything else going on. And the Tennessee season opening around April 1st, there just isn't a problem there, you know, and after we actually got the data and we started thinking about it, we thought, well, you know, that mechanism that was going to make this work just isn't happening when you open that season at the nest initiation, during a nest initiation period. Now, if you went back into, you know, say February 1st and started shooting gobblers, or, you know, March 1st or even March 15th, the results could have been different. But given Tennessee's timing, and given the relative level of harvest, like on our study sites, 30% of the gobblers get harvested.
Yeah, same average across all the southeastern states.
Yeah, you know, so we have average turkey hunters and average turkey population. You know, it just isn't there.
Yeah, I think that's very critical to put this in context. Dave and I, in our study results, are not saying or indicating that a delay to the hunting season cannot be impactful. To put it in context with our study, what we're saying is when you compare reproduction and productivity, when the season opens just prior to peak nest initiation, and you compare that to opening the season just prior to peak incubation initiation, we didn't see a difference. And different states have different frameworks, of course, north to south. Nesting chronology, with regard to the timing is different. And so it could be certainly that some states could have seasons that may benefit turkeys if they opened later. But, you have to look at that in the biological context, not necessarily just saying, a 7-day delay or 14-day delay is what we need. You got to put it in context.
Yeah, it needs to be relative to the biology of the animal. And if the season coincides with initiation, as Tennessee's formerly did, that doesn't seem to have any difference based on your experiment compared to delaying it to be coinciding with incubation.
Right. And so when you then also look at the gobbling chronology and you look at the hunter response data, which is what
I was about to ask you about that.
We have all of those components. Of course, nothing drives hunter satisfaction more than being out there and hearing gobbles. I mean, that's their number one satisfaction metric. And so gobbling in Tennessee is peaking in late March and early April, according to the data that we've collected across the state. Maybe a little another sub peak in mid-April, and then trending off from there. And so that's why we indicated that if the season were to open in early April, that would capture the gobbling peak. That would make hunters more happy. And that is consistent with when our experimental delay occurred, which was on April the 2nd and April the 3rd. That's when the control counties opened. And so we're confident in saying that if the season was moved earlier to open in early April in Tennessee, there would not be problems with productivity as related to the opening day.
Craig, a question for one of you guys to answer. Did you ask the hunters to rate their experience, or how did were they happy with the delay compared to the control, or how did that affect the hunting experience as they reflected on in your survey?
The overall satisfaction was relatively low in the delay counties before the delay, and relatively low, and it mirrored each other. It did not change at all after the delay. In the no delay counties, it was a little above average before the delay. And then after the delay, although there was not a delay in the no delay counties, keep that in mind, it bumped up just slightly, but it was not. There was no statistical difference. So the delay did not impact hunter satisfaction. And
overall,
whether the season was delayed or not, and whether there was a bag limit of 4 or 3 or 2, hunters killed the same number of birds. On average, 50% of the hunters killed a bird, and then most of those who killed a bird only killed 1. And there were a few that would kill 2. And when the limit was 3, I think it was like 9% that would kill 3. And so most of them would only kill 1 bird, and only half the hunters would kill a bird either before or after the delay. It didn't matter.
So the delay did not impact the satisfaction or the number of birds taken?
No.
Nor did the bag limit.
Yeah, one interesting thing that did happen that
didn't reduce the harvest either.
Yeah, one interesting thing that did happen is that when they instituted the delay, and when you think about it, it made sense. Hunters became more efficient at killing birds. So, like, if you don't hunt those first 2 weeks and you go out on April 15th, that is a great time to kill a turkey. And so the hunter efficiency went up with the delay. And, that's something to consider. But even so, when asked the question, would you rather move it back to April 1st or not, if it doesn't have an effect? I think it was something like 75% of the hunters said, well, if it's not going to have a biological benefit, we want to go back to April 1st.
What is that because they were hearing more gobbling?
Now think about this. If the season was closed and it didn't open until most of the hens were beginning to get on the nest, that's you're going into the turkey woods at that time when the gobblers are most likely to respond to calling. I don't think anybody would be surprised by that. And so, especially on opening weekend when the season was delayed and opening in mid-April, you had a higher number of birds killed because of the state that they were in, with regard to hens being on the nest. But when you study that with regard to what the hunters wanted, they still wanted to be out there when gobblers are gobbling more, although they might not be as receptive to come in. So, there's a psychological aspect there, what you like most, but apparently most hunters like to be out there with gobbling birds and the challenge of getting one to come in, even though there are hens around. And then, as we all know, as the nesting season progresses and more of the hens are on the nest, then according to previous hunting pressure, the gobblers are more likely to respond to calling.
Yeah, and the other piece of that is, like in Tennessee, the season is 6 weeks long. So it would open up April 1st and close about May 15th. But then with the delay, it opened April 15th and closed at the end of May. And so what it really comes down to is, would you rather have those first 2 weeks in April when all that gobbling's going on and there's hens all over the place, or the last 2 weeks in May, if you're going to have a 6-week season?
Where it's hot and
I don't even
silent.
have to think about that one.
No, regardless of anything else, I'd rather have those 2 weeks in April, even if I don't kill a bird because they're all henned up. I want to be out there in April. And that's pretty much what the hunters said, is they'd rather have those first 2 weeks in April than the last 2 weeks in May. Everything else.
Did they actually hear more gobbling? Did y'all have a metric for that in the survey?
Yeah, so there was a decline. The gobbling declined in the delay counties by 39% because of that 2 week delay. So, and the interesting thing is, even though the gobbling declined and their overall satisfaction was related to gobbling, the delay county satisfaction still didn't change. So it's, there's some offsetting things going on.
Yeah. But they were the hunting community was pretty clear that if there wasn't a biological reason to delay it,
right,
they want to hear gobbling, and I can relate to that. I like hearing gobble too.
I can relate to it too, because they don't come to my calling, nor do they gobble at it. So I might as well go out there when they're doing it on their own.
I just need to hear them, to know they're around. That's what I need. They're not responsive to my calling anyway.
Well, I can tell you one thing, and I'm sure Craig agrees wholeheartedly. When you're sitting on the porch on April 7th or April 10th, and there's a bird gobbling up the ridge from your house, tearing it up, and you're thinking, we've done this whole study. What the heck? What the heck am I doing here?
Mm.
But,
to be fair, the agency, Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, and the commissioners all either recommended or voted to move the season earlier. And as of now, I think that's what they're going to do. And I think that's good.
Yeah. In response to the data.
I think that is extremely commendable.
Well, it's for them making good decisions and, using science as they can to, as a foundation for what they're recommending. And the agency, of course, going through with such a study and helping out in every aspect of the project. And also, as I understand, they likely are going to keep a 2-bird bag limit, which, although in our summary, we indicated that the population probably should be able to absorb a 3-bird limit. But, a 2-bird, in my personal opinion, a 2-bird bag limit is fine with me, because I think if nothing else, that could help bank a few more birds, whether it be on private lands or on public lands, and help in some situations to have a few more gobbling birds out there come the following spring. So, to my knowledge, at least, of what they've done and recommended, I think is good.
Yeah, the other thing that they have voted on is to ultimately reduce the Jake bag limit to 1 per hunter. And that's something that we've also looked at. I'm right in the process right now of calculating Jake's survival just out of curiosity. And it's, if you don't shoot Jakes, and on our study sites, like I think 2 to 3% of the Jakes were actually harvested, radiotake birds were harvested, as opposed to 13% of the harvest in those counties being made up of Jakes overall. So on our study sites, hunters were generally not harvesting Jakes. But if you don't shoot them, those little suckers live to be 2-year-old gobblers at a really high rate. And I don't have the exact number yet, but I think it's going to be somewhere around 75% of those Jakes. That annual survival in that 1 to 2-year-old transition is about 75%.
Man,
and
if we could get
obviously
hens that high.
for me, being for many decades a strong proponent of quality deer management, do you see the common theme? If you let the young birds live, you get to hunt the older birds the following season. So to me, that's kind of a no-brainer. I hope we get to that point. I'm certainly glad that it's limited to 1 Jake, but hopefully we can take it a step farther.
Well, because that's a management action, a regulatory action that could increase the gobbler population almost immediately. And, it's not going to be a huge difference, but it might be a 10% bump, I mean, it's the easiest thing the regulatory agency can do to increase that gobbler population by, say, like in our case, like something like 10%.
Yeah. Well, and plus 2-year-olds gobble a lot, and they have a high mortality rate to hunting.
Yeah.
So they seem to be receptive to some of us less skilled hunters.
Well, the other thing that the commission has done, and they recognize, was that one of the reasons why they didn't come all the way back to April 1st again is because when they did the delay, the youth hunt went into the first week in April. And if you know what the weather is like in Tennessee, maybe not so much this year, but in some years, if you're turkey hunting in March, there can be snow. And so you literally have the kids out there at the worst possible time to hunt. If you delay that a couple of weeks into April when the weather gets good, the youth success rate and probably participation in harvest rate went up significantly. So they had the best youth hunts ever. And the commissioners felt pretty strongly that they wanted to capture some of that benefit for the kids because of the importance of recruiting the next generation of turkey hunters. And I can appreciate that.
I can get behind that.
And even in terms of like the Jake question, let the kids shoot a Jake. Just for the sake of having some success and having the thrill of getting a turkey. They don't know the difference the first time you shoot a bird, whether it's a big old gobbler or not. But
it's a trophy for them.
Yeah, it's a great thing.
May cultivate a lifelong passion for it.
Yeah, so some of the things the agency did, the agency recommendation and the commission recommendations, they were sort of in line with what we were hoping for. And I think they incorporated, some of the results of the study, but they're balancing, the hunters, the future generations, and the resource. And, the way they see the balance there, of course, is not going to be exactly the way we see it, but it's all good, both ways.
Man, what a great discussion. Did we miss anything?
Yeah. Is there anything we should be asking you guys or that you really wanted to discuss? Well,
so there's one little minor thing. Dr. Gerhold has done an outstanding job on the disease front, and they're still continuing to work on disease, and he's got a PhD student that's finishing up this year that will be summarizing a lot of that work. But the key thing was there was a lot of interest in whether the spreading chicken litter was spreading disease from domestic poultry to wild turkeys. And they basically were unable to really establish a strong population level effect there. They documented a whole bunch of diseases and as being present out in the wild, but they didn't find the smoking gun that would explain the regional decline of turkeys. And so I think that's really important, because this was one of the largest, longest running turkey disease surveillance studies I think that's ever been done. A lot of these other states are now starting to do some disease surveillance, but they got really interesting results, but no clear, compelling evidence that disease is a strong contributor to the population decline.
So what I'm hearing is spreading chicken litter is not causing the decline.
Well, ironically enough, the three southern counties are closest to that source and undoubtedly have the most chicken litter being spread, and their fecundity for the last 7 years has been the greatest. So, if it's impacting reproduction anyway, we certainly weren't able to show it. And the hen survival down there was better. Right. So every metric that we had in those southern counties, regardless of the delay, was always better.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we had Rick on, I think it was Marcus, maybe 6-8 weeks ago, something like that.
Okay.
And
great.
He went into a little bit more detail on, all the reasons that litter may or may not affect turkeys, and, the life cycle of the parasite and all that kind of stuff. So that's good stuff. Glad you reiterated.
Well, one thing that we need to mention is the hard work and the dedication of the graduate students. Vinny Johnson got his master's degree, and Joe Quayle got his master's degree. Lindsay Phillips is getting her PhD, and Casey Swafford is getting her master's degree, and we have another student coming on to the project. So none of this would have been possible without them and their hard work, and they've all done a tremendous job. Dave and I are really, really fortunate to have that group of graduate students on this project, and proud of what they've done and accomplished.
Yeah, nice to bring
up. We can't do it without them.
Yeah, impressive that quite a few turkey enthusiasts got trained on this project. So a great overall project.
And of course, lots of technicians that spent countless hours helping to collect and put data in the computer and that type of thing. But it's been a good ride, and it's not over, and we're just now starting to get lots of papers out. So it's an exciting time.
So speaking of that, Craig, the main paper that we were discussing today, the season date delay, y'all have published that, correct?
It has been accepted.
Okay,
yeah,
so it's been accepted at a peer-reviewed journal.
Yep. So it's accepted, and if it is available when this is launched, it will be linked in the show notes for anybody that wants to read it or share it with anybody.
And as I mentioned, we also developed a project summary that we're going to give to the funding agencies, of course, Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, the National Wild Turkey Federation, and Turkeys for Tomorrow. So I imagine they would probably post our project summary that would be a little easier to read and digest than a peer-reviewed journal article.
Yep, we can link that if it's available also.
Sure.
All right, guys, that was a really great conversation. I think we was pretty much went around the entire topic, well-rounded.
But before we go, I must say one word: fire. I don't think I've ever been on a podcast with y'all that fire wasn't mentioned. So there, we got that out. So we have been.
We just talk about frequent
mentioning
burning.
Fire on every podcast.
I appreciate that, Craig.
Yeah, that's good.
All right.
I mean, Will says corn on everyone too.
Well, as a small landowner who my neighbor plants 3 acres of corn, and
you got to compete with him, Dave.
No, he plants 3 acres on my farm.
Oh, okay.
And he has
That's how you got to work it out.
Harvesting equipment, and it's amazing how inefficient he is, because when he's harvesting my corn, there is corn laying all over up there. And this year it didn't, my best corn crop ever, and the most waste corn ever. And the turkeys didn't come in, and I don't know what to think about it. So
I hear you should have used crickets, maybe.
Than me. I need 4 acres.
I hear that's the thing now.
I'm going for 4 acres this year.
There you go.
There you go.
Crickets and corn.
Yeah.
Good.
You got to feed the
right,
crickets
guys.
corn so they're corn-flavored crickets.
Hey, now we're on to something.
Well,
It's
we
starting
really
to get deep in here.
Yeah. We really appreciate y'all's time. We better cut this off before this conversation devolves further than it already has. But Craig, Dave, thank y'all so much. And to all the listeners, we really appreciate y'all's support. If you like what you're hearing here, just help us share it. Leave us a rating and a review. We always appreciate that. It helps us get the word out to as many folks as possible.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for listening.
Good to talk to you, fellas.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.